mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle C.K. Hoffler et je suis présidente du National Bar Association, l'association du barreau national. Le NBA, comme nous l'appelons affectivement, entre parenthèses, ça n'a rien à faire avec le basket, est le plus grand et le plus ancien barreau dont les membres sont majoritairement noirs au monde, car nous représentons les intérêts de plus de 66 000 avocats, juges, étudiants en droit et professeurs de droit. Nous avons plus de 80 associations affiliées et je suis fière de dire que nous avons des représentants des barreaux associés du Botswana et de l'Afrique du Sud au sein de notre conseil de gouverneurs. Comme chacun de vous le sait, avant le COVID, le NBA convenait cette réunion dans des destinations internationales pour favoriser une plus grande collaboration internationale et pour discuter des questions d'importance mondiale. Littéralement, le NBA a parcouru le monde entier et surtout la diaspora, y compris plusieurs pays du continent africain, des îles Caraïbes, de l'Europe, de l'Asie et de l'Australie, Nouvelle-Zélande. En effet, nous avons voyagé sur tous les continents et sommes fiers de notre riche histoire. Cette conférence est notre première conférence virtuelle. Elle est conçue en collaboration avec les barreaux des nations africaines et de nos frères et sœurs des îles Caraïbes pour aborder les problèmes sociaux et civiques qui affligent non seulement les États-Unis, mais qui ont également un impact mondial. Au cours des 3 prochains jours, nous démystifierons certains mythes, mettrons sur la lumière nos luttes communes, fournirons des conseils sur les meilleures pratiques et offrirons un leadership sur des questions clés, y compris le maintien de l'ordre, les problèmes de santé au niveau mondial et les droits de l'homme. Nous reconnaîtrons et honorerons les icônes qui ont mené et qui mènent toujours le combat pour la justice et l'égalité sur la scène mondiale. Nous donnerons un prix inaugural au nom du révérend Jesse Jackson, qui a eu un impact considérable dans la lutte pour les droits de l'homme et la dignité humaine dans la diaspora et dans le monde. Les 3 prochains jours, mesdames et messieurs, seront engageants, stimulants et réels. Nous vous invitons à écouter et à vous engager. Nous vous remercions en avance, mesdames et messieurs, de nous joindre avec le reste du monde. Merci. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is C.K. Hoffler, and I am the president of the National Bar Association. The NBA, as we call it, which of course has nothing to do with the Basketball Association, is the largest and oldest predominantly Black bar association in the world, as we represent the interests of over 66,000 lawyers, judges, law students, and law professors. We have over 80 affiliate chapters, and I'm proud to say that we have representatives from the Black Bar Associations from Botswana and South Africa on our board of governors. Each of you know, before COVID, the NBA would take an international trip to an international destination to foster greater collaboration internationally and discuss issues of global importance. Literally, the NBA has traveled the world and the diaspora, including several countries on the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. Indeed, we've traveled to all continents and are proud of our rich history. This conference is our first virtual conference, and it's designed along with our African nations and Caribbean brothers and sisters to address the social and civic issues that plague not only the United States, but have a global impact as well. The next 3 days will address the myths, highlight the struggle with the best practice answers, research and thought leadership on key topics, including policing issues, health issues, and human rights issues. We will also recognize and give honor to icons on the battlefield for these causes who have led and who are leading the fight for justice and equality on a global stage. We will also be giving an inaugural award in the name of the great Reverend Jesse Jackson, who has had a tremendous impact on the struggle in the diaspora and for people globally. Our 3 days will be engaging, provocative, and real. We invite you to listen and to be engaged, and we thank you in advance for joining us from around the world.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening to those who are joining us from around the globe, or good morning, as it might be. I want to welcome you again to the first virtual ever National Bar Association International Summit. We are so excited to be able to have this summit at this time in the world. As many of you know, if you follow the National Bar, you're aware that this year we have focused on three main pandemics: COVID-19, voter suppression, and police brutality. But for this international conference, our theme is forging a path forward, connecting the diaspora to attack global pandemics, COVID-19, police brutality, voter suppression, and structural impediments to development. And for the first fireside chat that we're going to have, really the first event for this international summit, I am joined by two dynamic lawyers, both of them originally from the continent of Africa, and who have practiced here in the United States in dynamic areas and can speak to some of these issues and how, from a global perspective, they have played themselves out throughout the world. Our first person that I'm going to chat with is an extraordinary attorney, Latif Oduola-Owoo, out of Atlanta, Georgia, who specializes in commercial litigation, high stakes commercial litigation, products liability, immigration law, and contract work. And when I say contract commercial litigation, if you will. He's originally from Nigeria, and he's going to talk a little bit about his background, but he's been practicing here in the US, was trained at law school both in Nigeria and here in the United States. And he's just an extraordinary lawyer who's built a strong reputation for himself here in the United States. The second lawyer who's going to join us, her name is Julie Wenah. Julie Wenah is an internationally recognized lawyer as well. She's done civil rights work, privacy work, intellectual property work, and has successfully teamed up to launch products, policies, legislation focusing on equitable and solutions for domestic and international markets. Indeed, she helped to develop for Airbnb their engagement in Africa in particular. She also worked with the Obama administration, working with the White House and the Department of Commerce, and she led President Obama's manufacturing initiative and worked on creating regulatory frameworks, ladies and gentlemen, and technical assistance supporting energy agreements in Africa. Julie is going to join us in a few minutes, and I just wanted to welcome Latif to this fireside chat, to this discussion, to lead this international summit. Good afternoon, Latif. How are you?
Good afternoon, CK. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Well, Latif, we're going to jump right in it. I know that you and I have had these discussions before about voter suppression, about COVID-19, and the impact globally. So let's set the stage for the audience of COVID-19. We know here in the United States that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities, without a question. Whether it came to testing, when COVID-19 first became a pandemic that people were aware of, I want to say last February 2020, and particularly in March of 2021, it really hit our communities with a bang. There was a lot of trepidation. There were not testing centers in Black and Brown communities here in the United States. And even now, as we have rolled out vaccinations, in some communities, we're seeing a lack of trust, if you will, with the standard or traditional information that's out there relative to testing. But that's here in the United States. Latif, what I wanted to do in setting the table for our audience is, how has COVID manifested itself in the diaspora in particular and globally? We see these tragic pictures of what's happening in India. We know that there are variants all over the place. And we know what happens throughout the world will also happen in the United States. So Latif, can you set the table for our audience of COVID, and so that we can discuss some of the other pandemics at this conference through that lens of COVID, because that's a reality that we're experiencing?
Thank you, CK, for the opportunity. I think the inequities that attended the way COVID played out in the United States are also existing in the global sphere. The difference is that in the US, at least we have a government that's focused on trying to reduce those inequities. But I think it helps to envision a split screen. On one end, you see what's going on in the high income countries like the US and most of Europe, right? Trillions of dollars have been poured into the economy to maintain the economy. They have access and control of billions of vaccines. People are actually being vaccinated. And there's this anticipation for the economy opening up so people can travel and take vacations and even go to arenas for soccer games, football games, or basketball games. So the outlook is optimistic. Then on the other side, you see what's happening in India. You see pictures of, pyres where people are being incinerated in public. Clearly hundreds of thousands of people are dying with lack of oxygen. They're literally gasping for oxygen. Now, the problem is this, right? We know that a virus anywhere is a virus everywhere. Yes. So there has to be a concerted effort to really address those inequities. It's important because when you look at, the so-called low-income countries, the challenges they have is, first of all, they don't have the resources to acquire the vaccine at a rate that's sufficient to vaccinate the population. Well, and even those who have the vaccines, vaccination is a real challenge in its own right, because for every dollar you spend in acquiring a vaccine, you need to spend $5 in training people and mobilizing people and ultimately vaccinating people. That's a challenge.
Yeah. Well, Latif, and I don't want to interrupt you, but let me just stop you there. Let's go to the continent and also to the Caribbean. We look at the diaspora. We're looking at Black and brown people universally, but let's now turn to the African continent, and then I want you to comment also on the Caribbean. Let's be very, very specific. What are we seeing there?
Okay. What we're saying in the African continent is, fortunately, for reasons that are not clear yet, COVID has not had a devastating impact yet on most of the African continent. Now, in South Africa, there's been a major outbreak, and some variants have come out of South Africa. But the reality of it is that most of Africa has been relatively insulated from very large outbreak. Nobody has been able to explain satisfactorily why that has happened, but it will be foolhardy to hope that that's going to continue with the variants that are coming with the lack of vaccination. Somebody asked me a question: what keeps you up at night? And to me personally, what keeps me up at night in a country as highly populated as Nigeria, with very limited resources, if we have a major outbreak, how are we going to handle that? Half of my family is here, but the other half is in Nigeria. How do we prevent that? Those are the kind of things that I hope our leaders need to address. And both in terms of vaccine, which is the beginning, they do not even have enough vaccine, let alone vaccination. So the projections are that maybe by the end of 2023, there will be sufficient vaccination. That's 2 years out. God knows how many variants will be in play at that time. God knows even if the vaccine that we have today will be adequate to address the challenges that we will have 3 years from now, or 2 or 3 years from now, in a dynamic virological environment where the virus itself is constantly morphing. So these are real challenges that's happening on the African continent. Very, very low level of vaccination, compounded by poor economy, because unlike here, the government don't have enough money to sustain the economy. And so those are real challenges.
So when we're talking about the African continent, is the international community corralling and trying to make available resources to send to countries on the continent? Because what we see with India, we saw all of those, very, very sad images, the numbers. hundreds of thousands of people dying per week. And it's really, it's taken the word pandemic to a new level. And when are we seeing the same level of engagement? Because the United States and other countries in Europe have sent supplies, have sent vaccination supplies and the like to India to help out with, in addition to ventilators and the like. Are we seeing the same level of engagement when it comes to those countries in Africa? And understanding that the outbreak has not been reported on the same levels, like you said, for inexplicable reasons, in many countries, the numbers of people that are either infected or dying from COVID is much lower. So what has been the international response to the obvious lack of resources in terms of vaccination and testing on the African continent, based on your experience?
Well, yes, there is some level of international solidarity. For example, the COVAX program was designed to acquire a vaccine, but the reality is nowhere near enough. And those efforts have to be multiplied at least tenfold to get to the level where we can rest assured that, okay, this situation is under control. My understanding is that, and there are real political challenges. Take the US, for example. Even though the US now has access to vaccine that can vaccinate its entire population 2-3 times over. And the real issue they're dealing with now is vaccine hesitancy. How do you bring in people and convince them to get vaccinated? That is not necessarily the case. But even then, only now are they beginning to say, okay, we're going to send some vaccines to Mexico and Canada and maybe in India. So that's going to take a challenge because that's a political situation. But there's also, unfortunately, it has to be said, a two-class system, even in the vaccines that are available. We have access to the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and then with respect to AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, even the Johnson & Johnson, because of the issues associated with the so-called embolism, that granted, it's very, very rare, but the public perception is that those vaccines are inferior. And because of that, those are the vaccines that tend to become available to those countries in Africa and other places where they need them. And people are asking themselves legitimate question: why do we not get the Pfizer vaccines? Why are you giving us the vaccines that you have rejected, even if it's only temporary? Now, I personally believe those vaccines are efficacious and they can serve the purpose, but there's got to be some amount of education so that people can actually begin to have a certain level of confidence in those vaccines. So those are real challenges, and we have to start by making those vaccines available. It looks like it's going to take some time, but then actually get people vaccinated, which is a greater challenge. But I have no doubt that we will get there. It may just take us a little longer. And
Latif, what about testing centers? I've read and heard and been involved in dialogue on an international front where there was a lack of testing centers in a lot of communities throughout the continent. So when we talk about the numbers being low, do you attribute those low numbers to the lack of testing centers, for instance?
There's no doubt in my mind that that's partly a factor, because the more you test, the more accurate is your appreciation of what's going on. And most African countries, we don't have those tests there. Now, there is a trend which has happened here as well, is once you have access to vaccine and you start vaccinating, testing becomes less important, right. So personally, I believe that resources will be better spent making vaccines available, vaccinating people, and then some element of testing to just be able to track how well you're doing. But you're right, testing is a major problem. And until we have those access to the vaccine, testing hopefully can give us a sense of how bad things are. And fortunately, there have been very simple tests that have now become available that people can get tested with a swab from the mouth, and results will be available readily. But the
All right. Well, now I want to switch.
problem is the same thing when you come about African countries, is that there's not enough resources to acquire those. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to switch now because we're setting the table. We're operating in COVID. So now, Latif, let's talk about police brutality. The world watched in horror when they saw the video of George Floyd. For initially it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then, of course, in the course of the trial, we knew it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds when he was literally murdered by a police officer who had his neck to his throat. And when he was gasping for air, saying he couldn't breathe, but the police officer, Derek Chauvin, continued until he breathed his last breath of air. So the world watched that. Now, we know here in the United States, police brutality is not new. And Black and brown communities, in fact, it's been, in my impression, I call it a pandemic. It was a pandemic before COVID became a pandemic. In fact, the civil rights movements have focused in large part on police brutality and need for policing reform. The Congressional Black Caucus has been keenly focused on this. The Congressional Black Caucus were the primary authors of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. This has been a pandemic in this country for a very long time. The difference now with the murder of George Floyd is the world all of a sudden became, as we say here in the United States, woke. They awakened to the devastation of this because they saw it on video. And that caused a bevy of protests, not just in the United States, but also globally. So, and this is during COVID, people protesting, saying Black Lives Matter. What we observed and what we know is that Black and brown communities throughout the world have been impacted by the killing of George Floyd. We saw people protesting in London, for example, in Paris, and being arrested for staying in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm just using those as examples. So can you talk a little bit about the police brutality and how it's manifested itself globally, having been triggered this new awakening by George Floyd's brutal murder?
Absolutely. And I think whether we like it or not, the US is a beacon to the rest of the world. And the way we fight our struggles, the way we address those issues is being replicated all over the world. In Nigeria recently, I'm sure there was an issue with SARS. SARS is this police structure that the government put in place. Now, Nigeria, you don't have racial issues, but that is not to suggest that because it's important for government to control the security apparatus, to maintain the people peaceful. It's some kind of peace that arises out of fear of retribution. And because of that, most of the time you see that in the context of election, where the government is in power, controls this security apparatus, and the opposition becomes the target of police brutality. And but in light of what happened with the George Floyd protest, there's been a mobilization in Nigeria against the SARS security outfit. So much so that ultimately, because it was on Twitter all over the place, because it was on Instagram, and because it made the government look feeble and incapable, ultimately they were able to get this outfit dismantled, which was a rare, a rare event in Nigeria. That goes to show that, the way we do things here inspires the same kind of reaction and the same kind of efforts in the rest of the world.
Well, I do know that, many, many years ago, many of us, and these efforts were led by some of our civil rights leaders here, Reverend Jackson, late Congressman John Lewis, Randall Robinson, so many, Charles Ogletree, and many of our National Bar Association leaders, we all were protesting the South African apartheid regime. This was in the 80s. This was particularly in the 80s. And we were protesting, of course, the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela. And many National Bar members were part of the teams in the international community that monitored the elections. But we know that it was the pressure that was put on from outside forces externally and boycotting those companies that did business with the South African government that in large part resulted in the in large part, and again, of course, there were other dynamics in the in the destruction, if you will, of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So there are many that are saying now with police brutality, what's happening in the US is affecting, just as you use the example, what's happening globally, but also what's happening globally, the global pressure from the United Nations and other international organizations and agencies has had an impact on what's happening here in the United States. What do you say to that?
No, absolutely. We live in a global village, except that the village itself is getting smaller because of the communication. Everybody, my mother is 86, she has a Facebook account. That's just the way it is. And because of that, I think there is room really, because police brutality in Africa, like I alluded to earlier, you usually see that in the context of elections.
Yes.
Elections, the government in power controls the security forces and the opposition becomes the target of police brutality. Unfortunately, even in countries that are doing as well as Cote d'Ivoire, as Guinea, who as a professor, as the president, you see octogenarians, people who are 80 years and older, amending the constitution so they can have a third term, but because they control the security apparatus, they're able to do that, and the opposition is the target, so there has to be an international outcry, and it's easier for them, it's easier for that to be done today. I'm hoping that more governments, as those situations come up, will have the courage to speak up and say, this is unacceptable. You cannot use the police against your own people. That's yet to be seen, unfortunately.
Well, let's talk a bit about the digital divide. In this country, one of the things that COVID underscored was the digital divide. The fact that in Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, poor communities, when people had to work from home or do their classes from home, a lot of those communities did not have access to the technology. Julie Wenah has joined us. Julie, I introduced you earlier as not just a lawyer who's been involved in civil rights, privacy rights, but technology. Ladies and gentlemen, she's dynamic. She has done so much in the private sector and also in the public sector. So Julie, talk to us a little bit about technology and the digital divide and what you're seeing from a social justice lens here in the United States and also globally.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam President. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Latif and the rest of the National Bar Association members and community. So, I feel incredibly fortunate that I've had an opportunity to work at the intersection of civil rights, tech, product inclusion, all things community manufacturing from both a tech and a government perspective. And one of the through lines that I've seen, CK, with respect to, how we build products, how we build the future, right? Because products and technology is driving the way that the future is going to be shaped, is really informing the way the future will be shaped. And one of the key things that I see is a lack of access from an equity perspective. There are certain people that are at the table designing and building and engineering and creating. And then I'm also seeing, so when that happens, then you end up building technology or products that aren't built for someone who has accessibility needs, for someone who is a woman, for someone who has a darker skin tone, maybe an algorithm is not correctly reading something. And we know that, I always say the technology train is moving. The spaceship has launched. There's nothing we can do to stop it. What we want to do is choose the seat that we want to be on this ship, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people of color, namely Black people, don't get an opportunity to do that. So, the through lines that I'm seeing is the ability for people of all backgrounds to be at the table in developing for the future from a product perspective, from a tech perspective. And then in some of the work that I did on the continent in Africa, one thing, that I try to make sure, and this is for beyond Africa, but I think oftentimes government and private industries that are based in the United States can approach countries from a foreign direct investment perspective with a very Western mentality of how they think things should be, and why aren't you moving this fast, or how come you don't do it like this, or why doesn't your framework look like that? And one thing that I try to be very mindful of in the work that I've done in government and in the private sector is to make sure that I'm not walking into any conversation with European counterparts, Asia Pacific counterparts, African counterparts, or teams that we're hoping to support with a Western mentality and lens on how something needs to be. So Madam President, to answer your question, I think the through line is product inclusion and making sure that people of all backgrounds are at the table in building. And that's one thing that I'm incredibly focused about.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so, with technology, we know, for instance, that in a lot of protests and uprisings throughout the world, a lot of that has been technology driven. We hear about protests and some people say wars that are being fought through Facebook, through social media, through access to social media. So, Julie, it's even more important now that people have that access and there's widespread access, particularly during COVID. So I'd like to talk a little bit with you, Julie, about a subject that's near and dear to me, and that is this extraordinary rise that we're seeing globally of Black women, Black and brown women throughout the world, in various areas of the profession, but just the social justice and the civil rights component, and women that we're seeing leading different organizations for the first time internationally, domestically as well. Can you speak a little bit to that based on your experience and the work that you've done in women's equity? Hi, Julie?
She's muted.
Okay. Julie, you're muted.
Oh, there it is.
Okay,
I'm sorry, my controls were turned off. With respect to women's equity globally, this is also an area that excites me just as it excites you. And I'm sure Latif, it also excites you. I think Black and brown women have been at and Indigenous women have been at the forefront of many movements, not just in this country, but in the world globally. And oftentimes not getting the credit, the acknowledgement, the uplift, the empowerment, primarily because we're not doing it for that, right? We're doing it to bring our generation a step further, to be better, to be more human, to be more thoughtful, to be more insightful, and to be more impactful. And what I'm seeing is, especially after George Floyd was murdered, I'm seeing more and more people becoming either aware of their privileges, right? Like I'm a Black woman. I'm a woman, right? So that's gender. I'm a Black woman, that's race. And I'm a dark-skinned Black woman, that's color, because sometimes people forget about color as a protected class. And I have all that, but I recognize that, there are Black trans women. I'm a cisgender woman. There are Black trans women that are experiencing issues. So the things that I'm seeing and the conversations that I'm having with communities are all focused on, what is the future that we want to see and design, and how do we make sure that our voices are at the table? And oftentimes you're seeing a lot of women do that. I serve on the Women in Product Board, and this board is focused on advancing the careers of women in product, ensuring that they're equipped with the tools needed to advance in their product careers. And we understand that, building product is not a spectator sport. You have to get in there, you have to be part of the product development process from inception to launch. And who's part of that process? When you're building something in tech, you have data scientists, you have engineers, you have researchers, you have your engineers. And thinking through those components and who's part of it. Now, when we're talking manufacturing, that's made up a little different, but making sure that ecosystem is diverse and enriched is what's going to build for a better future. So I'm encouraged about what's to come with women at the forefront. I mean, they do call it Mother Earth. I feel like that comes from somewhere, right? The thing that births it all. So I'm excited about the work that we're seeing with women equity. And I hope that we continue to be intentional about the intersectionality pieces within it.
Very much. And I know we've got our second panel where we have the former Attorney General of the Bahamas, Allison Maynard Gibson, who's also going to speak about women's issues and the significance of social justice in the world and in the Caribbean. But let me just ask this question, Julie. As you travel, and Latif as well, as you travel throughout the world, because both of you all travel as lawyers, you know, we never can leave our law degree behind. And as you're talking to people, Julie, for you in technology, Latif, just globally based on the work that you do, what is your advice to young folk on what they should look forward to? Because there's so many pandemics now that we're confronting, with police brutality, with COVID-19, with infrastructure challenges in many, many countries that are discouraging for people. And also with voter suppression. We're going to talk about voter suppression in a second. What would be your recommendation to young folks and those who are tuning in and those who will gain access to this panel remotely? What would be your advice, Julie, starting with you?
My advice is short and sweet: color outside of the lines. For so long, we thought that there was a certain way you had to do a certain thing. There's not. Color outside the lines. Do the things that resonate with your spirit, with your soul, the thing that keeps you up at night, the thing that you do so well. Like, color outside the lines. There's no right way to do it. Obviously, don't harm anyone or yourself in the process. That's the caveat, but color outside the lines.
Absolutely. And Latif, what about you?
I think in order to give a useful advice, I will go back maybe 40 years. And when I was young, what would have helped me then? You know, they live now in an environment where young people with very little resources can do a lot. You know, with social media, it's a real powerful instrument. But it also, if you're a student in some African university somewhere, you have access to what's being taught at Harvard University. You have access to knowledge. Embrace that. And knowing that, you know, your current situation is not limiting anyway in what you can dream, and you have the tools to do your part and acquire that knowledge. And the rest is just a matter of time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Latif, for that, and Julie. And what we're going to do is we're going to shift a little bit and talk finally for this first fireside chat, because I see that Attorney General Allison Maynard Gibson has joined, as well as the Reverend Jesse Jackson. But I want to have this final question about voter suppression. In this country, one of the greatest pandemics that we have fought as the National Bar Association with our members and with our partners, including the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, Transformative Justice Coalition, Rainbow Push Coalition, and hundreds of grassroots organizations, has been voter suppression. It's at an all-time high. We've seen in many states such as Georgia, where I am now, where the state has passed some of the most oppressive, repressive, destructive voter suppression laws that we've seen in this country. They're calling it Jim Crow 2, clearly designed to impact Black and brown voters and designed to prevent us from voting. We saw extraordinary voter suppression during the Senate runoff elections here in Georgia that resulted in the victory of Senator Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff. But now, since that, and since their victory on January 5th, then on January 6th, we saw an attempted coup d'etat. Now, it's so interesting, ladies and gentlemen, how people, when they think of a coup d'etat, the countries that they think of are countries on the African continent. They always think, oh my goodness, you know, this president, that president, they did a coup d'etat, this and that. But they failed to characterize what happened on January 6th as a coup d'etat, an attempted takeover of the US government, starting with the Capitol, led by, many would say, I'm just reporting what we saw with our own eyes, our former president that played a role. There was an impeachment process as a result of that. There were, the world watched with, I believe, horror when they saw that such actions would actually take place here in the United States. Latif, you said it best. You said that people look to the United States as a model, as a golden standard for so many things. But I would dare say, based on what we're seeing with voter suppression laws and voter suppression in general here, and attempted coup d'etat, that we could learn something from many countries on the African continent and in the Caribbean. So that's the table that I'd like to set for the question, Latif, that I'm going to pose to you on voter suppression. What impact, if any, have you seen of the events in the United States during the last presidential elections, the Senate Georgia runoff elections, and also the voter suppressive laws that have been recently passed? What impact, if any, have you seen in our global community?
Wow.
I know that's a deep question.
It is a deep. I think at the end of the day, we have to choose what lesson we learn from that experience. Granted, there was a coup, and I agree with you, it was a coup, or at least an attempted coup. But then there was Georgia, and Georgia happened because we mobilized, because we were conscious, and that is what I choose to learn. At the end of the day, I think that's what most people who are similarly situated in African situations will learn as well. Continued mobilizations. You have to do this peacefully. You know, babe, go to the street to protest when you have to, articulate your position, talk to your neighbors, and mobilize. We live in a world now where there are forces of darkness, and when you're on the side of the light, ultimately you will prevail.
Okay. Well, that's very, very, very interesting. Julie, would you care to comment on that too, from your perspective? I mean, you look at the technological divide. You are someone who has traveled the world and has put in place energy programs and has worked both inside the US administration during the Obama era, as well as in the private sector, and you're making a difference as a young woman, and we're so proud of you. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what I loved about the last election cycle, I mean, the last couple, right? There are things that I really hated personally, and things that I think, but those things that I hated, I think galvanized people to change, right? So you started seeing a lot of young people step up, create organizations, create spaces to advocate for voting. But then it just really shows the systemic infrastructures that are deep rooted in this country that don't want certain people in positions of power. And that's scary. That's problematic. You have countries where voting is mandatory, right? You have to go. And I just, I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful that tech and social media can be a powerful force for good if used correctly, and if not used with nefarious intent and in a way that allows people to share information, as Latif was mentioning earlier, about SARS and some of the things that were happening in Nigeria, and how the power of social media allowed people to be connected and become aware of what was going around globally. So Madam President, those are the things that excite me, and let's be clear, like, I know we always talk about the younger generation, and I'm excited about them, but we got a lot to learn from our seasoned generation. They've been there, they've done that, they know it, they wrote the book, bought the shirt, own the hat, and I do think that there needs to be an exchange of information, ideas, so that history is not repeating itself and the same mistakes are being made.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So this is a great transition. So we've been joined by two extraordinary global leaders and icons. One, an extraordinarily impactful attorney general, former attorney general from the Bahamas, who led the way and also has been a great supporter of the National Bar Association, helped when we had a meeting in the Bahamas, led the way for us. But just as a woman, being an attorney general, brilliant social justice engineer, and I'm referring to none other than Allison Maynard Gibson. So we welcome you Attorney General Gibson to the table, and thank you so much in advance for all that you do. Many of us stand on your shoulders. We've followed you, we've watched you, we've supported you from afar. And as you travel the world and speak and help inspire people, and for all that you do, we want to thank you. I also am going to introduce another icon. You know, what can we say about the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson Sr.? I mean, what can we say? That he has been a civil rights and human rights icon and torchbearer for over 6 decades, that he has been someone in the diaspora. I had the pleasure of traveling to many countries on the continent with Reverend Jackson. And when I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, he is regarded as a head of state. The reverence, the respect, he's been there to fight the fight in the diaspora, not just in the diaspora, but just around the world. The first time, Reverend, when I worked with you in 1988, we went right to Libreville, Gabon. President El Hajj Omar Bongo had invited you to Gabon, and on the way we stopped in London, and you were negotiating a labor agreement that had international ramifications and implications. You have freed more people who have been imprisoned around the world than any other civilian or civil rights leader in the world. What the US government and other foreign governments couldn't do, Reverend Jesse Jackson has done. I had the pleasure of working with him to free 2 US citizens. One was in jail a couple of years ago, a professor, Dr. Elizabeth Alexander in Algeria, and Reverend Jackson within 48 hours freed her from jail. And another young man whose mother is a minister in the United States in Gainesville, Florida. Her son was in Macedonia, and Reverend Jackson within days freed him from jail. Again, what the US government and private sector intervention people were not able to do, Reverend Jackson was able to do. He's forged alliances in so many places and spaces where other governments have turned their back and made a difference globally. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. From a voting rights, civil rights, COVID, police brutality standpoint, Rainbow Push and Reverend Jackson have been at the forefront. And Reverend, we want you to know here at the National Bar, we appreciate you so much that we've named an award after you. The Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson Sr. International Civil and Human Rights Awards that will be bestowed upon 3 deserving individuals on the 3rd day of this conference. So Reverend Jackson, we talked about voting rights, and we know that that's in your, I want to say you're the father, one of the fathers of the voting rights movement, the civil rights movement in this country. You marched with Dr. King, you marched with those trailblazers. In March of 2020, I met with you and the late Congressman John Lewis, and I asked you all to help me design my civil rights, my voting rights platform. And this is in Washington in the late Congressman John Lewis's office. And you spent the time, you dedicated the time. I've worked with you for 33 years. That's almost my entire legal career, even though I'm 37. I just have to throw that out there. You know, Madam Attorney General, you know, we just have to keep it real. But anyway, but I also have the pleasure of serving as chair of your board of Rainbow Push Coalition, and I'm the first woman to serve in that capacity. I could speak for days and hours on all you've accomplished, but we only have a limited time. So Reverend Jackson, against that background and that introduction, I'm going to start with you on voting rights. You've been there at some of the first elections in many countries on the continent, as well as in the Caribbean. You've helped many countries in the Caribbean with their elections. So Reverend Jackson, what impact do you feel the events here in the US, the presidential elections, have had on voter suppression throughout the world? And I know Reverend Jackson, you're on mute now. So Bruce, if you could unmute him. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hi, Reverend Jackson.
Madam Attorney General, how do you do today? Attorney General, in the Bahamas.
Greetings from the Bahamas. It's an honor to be on the same panel as you, Reverend Jackson. You're a wonderful friend, not just of the Bahamas, of the world.
Thank you very much. Let me say, CK, I thank you for the overwhelming introduction of my work. I'm simply an instrument of God This is my life. It's my ministry. It's all I do. I'm obsessed with doing this. What I know is that the right to vote preserves all other rights. I'm not convinced yet that we are as sensitive to this issue as we ought to be. When, in 1967, Dr. King was president, was alive. Dick Hatcher and Carl Sook became mayors in 1967. Dr. King couldn't go to Gary because the blacks who were caught up with liberal white was fighting Hatcher. If Dr. King go, they would have embarrassed him. They would work, and so the Sunday before the election, he did a radio program and said, if I were in Gary, I would vote for Hatcher. That's all he could endorse on the side way. When the Cleveland with Carl Soaks got Carl elected as well, this is a time when they said Dr. King could only have meaning in the South, not in the North. So Gary and Cleveland became that for us. The last 50 years, we made more progress than the first 350 years in this country. When Tim Scott said America is not racist, but 1619 to 1865, we were officially racist, official. The law of the land. 157 years from our arrival here to the Constitutional Convention, we're 3/5 human. That was racist. Then when we joined the Union Army upon the Emancipation Proclamation and 13, 14, 15 amendments, which was a big deal in voting. And we left planted 200,000 joined the Union Army. We defeated the South, the Confederates. The trade-off was we saved the Union and they in slavery. Lincoln was on that agenda. They killed him. Johnson succeeded him, and then by 1896, took all the protections back. And actually, the segregation masters were more violent than the slave masters. These slave masters had an interest in keeping us alive to work. But on the slave, just say we 5,000 blacks were lynched. 5,000 were lynched from 1880 to 1940. We were a majority population in several other states. They depopulated the South through terror. All about the vote. After all, we had 8 black congressmen from South Carolina alone. We were politically, and the violence interrupted it. Now, my point is today, when you look at the attempts now to make voting off limits for us again, where we can't win. I can't help but think that they're using violence as a way to intimidate us. It's inspiring us to fight back. We're not going the way that we went in 1896. We're not going back. Coefficient of expansion. We're out the hole. We're not going back in that hole again. But it will be the test of our time. To think that 41 million people, those who voted for Trump, 70 million, voted against our basic civil rights. And they would lie and say he lost the election, he won the election. You got lawyers and PhDs who buy into the lie. This is a terrible thing we're looking at right now. Question for me is to young lawyers, what are you willing to do that you haven't done before? Demonstrate, time traffic. What are you willing to do? Because if they're successful, we will go from 4 to 6 Congress people in 10 years. They intend to cut that down. 45 Latino Congress people, 20 Asian Americans, 20 Native Americans. Most representative Congress we've ever had in our lives before. It's a big deal. And I submit to you that if they're able to take away election officials, then affirmative action will go as well. All the progress that we made will be in jeopardy. And so that's why I want you to really take a hard look at what we can do to make certain that this Congress, actually, it doesn't matter what they do. If we know what the rules are, we'll make it. But they're gonna play by 2 sets of rules. So I really thank you for your work in the Bahamas, holding on to what amounts to a desperate situation where we can win if we fight back. Here in America, they are shameless. You take Cruz, Princeton, Harvard man, acting as ignorant as somebody never went to high school. Cruz, you have people like that saying the election was not lost, was not won. He knows better. Knows better. These are not ignorant poor white people. These are congressmen, senators. I say we lost, we won the election. So my point is that we got to hit the streets again. College, everybody who's 18 and will be 18 by November can register and vote now. Every high school senior can register and vote now. All in college can register and vote now. You can leave a stone unturned as we fight this fight. And I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel.
Oh, thank you so much, Reverend. And we are going to hit the streets. You asked the question, what are the lawyers willing and ready to do? And we're willing and ready to continue to fight with you, because we believe that what we do here is going to reverberate and have an impact internationally. If we can win this battle here, Latif, you mentioned this, then we will be a role model for others who are fighting against voter suppression in other countries around the world.
No, role model. We have African, we aid and trade. Yes. We have the power to deliver something, not just ourselves. We can deliver something. We're empowered to do so. I mean, that's what's at stake here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Reverend Jackson. Every time, I guess it's been 33 years, Reverend, since we worked together, but every time you speak, I learn something new. And so I want to thank you for always being there. Again, there's so little that we can do to honor you, but we just said an award in your name was the least that we could do, because we want you to always be part of the legacy of the National Bar Association, because civil rights, human rights, protesting go hand in hand with what we believe is our mission at the National Bar as social justice engineers, because we're not going to be a parasite. We're going to be social justice engineers. So now I'd like to turn, if we could, to Madam Attorney General. It's very hard to introduce someone who is a barrister, a politician, a community rights advocate, particularly with regards to laws affecting women and children and access to justice. And our Madam Attorney General has served twice as the Attorney General and Minister for Legal Affairs for the Bahamas. She's a friend of the National Bar Association. She's a friend of access to justice. She's a friend of civil rights and human rights globally. Her work has included significant work on legal reforms globally, and she's done so much in the Caribbean and throughout the world. And so, Madam Attorney General, we just wanted to pose this question.
CK.
Yes, sir. Yes,
so you can't say grateful, you're also a beautiful sister. A beautiful sister.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you have given a speech that is entitled When Life Gives You Lemons, and you center on equal access to justice in the recovery. So, Madam Attorney General, could you comment on what you mean by that?
Yeah.
When life gives you lemons.
Please send me a copy of that speech, please.
I certainly will. Reverend.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me here. And let me congratulate you on this historic event, which is the first virtual convening and the international aspect as well. Before I go on to life-giving lemons in my speech, let me also, as you have done, thank Reverend Jackson. He certainly is an icon in terms of civil rights. And I just want to add that when you're talking about voting rights and what Reverend Jackson's lifetime has been about, it isn't just empowerment in a social sense, as you recognize, Madam President. I also want to point out that it just makes sense economically as well. When we speak about the diaspora and Africa, we're talking about 1.4 billion people. So voting, democracy is the environment that enables strong economies. So when we talk about 1.4 billion is a big market. And so rightly so, Madam President, you are really highlighting the importance of people like us, as Reverend Jackson has done also, who are members of the diaspora, focusing on how we can work together, not only from within America, but the diasporic members focusing on the rest of the diaspora and also Africa. And as you have said, justice is a part of that also. And I'd like us to widely consider justice to include social justice, as you do as well, Madam President. So if we focus on what the Secretary General has said, and I just want to give a quick snapshot of what he said in the Nelson Mandela lecture, he pointed out that COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray revealing fractures in the skeleton of the societies that we have built.
Mama.
Points out that 70% of the world's people are living with rising income and wealth inequality. And listen to this statistic, 26 of the richest people in the world hold as much wealth as half of the global population. Now, and he also points out that rising inequality sinks all boats, okay? So what we have to do is to make sure that our legal systems are actually, which are not fit for purpose at the moment, people are finding that they are not getting a justice in the justice system, actually are retooled so that those who are sinking into poverty and those who are unable to access justice systems are actually able to access the systems. Like I said, it makes sense economically, and also if we want to have strong societies, it's something that we have to do as well.
Absolutely. So when we talk about, access, just the, Reverend Jackson has mentioned about or talked about how together as a diaspora, and you mentioned this as well, how much we can do together for economic empowerment. And what I'm seeing as a shift, and Madam Attorney General, I don't know if you could comment on this, in the world is that we went from a stage where we talked about how we can collaborate. And now, because the dynamics, COVID-19, all these pandemics, people are turning to action. And that's what's necessary, action. Can you comment on some, based on your experience, what you're seeing when you travel the world, when you lecture, and some of the projects that you've been involved in that would constitute action in the diaspora where there's greater solidarity?
Okay, thank you.
CK, may I leave? Ministers here in Georgia.
Yes.
I plan to boycott the states to leverage the observed voting laws in Georgia. Please allow me to leave. I'm trying to do, please send me that speech you just wrote. I want a copy of it.
And Reverend, I'll make sure that you get it. And it's hard for me to say, Reverend, you're excused and you can leave, but I will defer to you, and Reverend, thank you for everything. And we'll be in touch and see you a little bit later in the program on Friday.
Thank you.
And I know there's something that you always say that begins with keep hope alive.
That's so important.
Okay. I'm sorry, you were saying?
Thank you, Madam President, what a treat to have Reverend Jackson with all of us. Thank you so much. So some of the action points that make sense. I wanted to keep that figure of this 1.4 billion people and how we can actually, as well as empowering people, make some economic impact as well. So when I was the Attorney General, I found that whenever I had consultations as I was changing our systems here with people who had actually been in the same position as I had been and could speak the same language, that we were always able to get more impact. So imagine members of the National Bar Association actually consulting in the diaspora with how to do things like make tribunals more accessible, how to establish, for example, in the criminal justice system, an office of the public defender, which is what we did in the Bahamas as an example, how to make courts technologically accessible, which is also what we did in the Bahamas. Let's not focus on international entities or private sector entities only engaging persons of another race. Let's talk about how we actually tap into our own resources, make a strong impact economically, and also, by the way, demonstrate to our children, generations to come, the importance of collaborating amongst ourselves and really generate the kind of impact, Madam President, that you have been speaking about for quite a while in your career, not just as president of the National Bar Association.
Well, I think that's a good segue, and thank you so much for that, to bring back Julie Wenah. Because Julie, we talk about, and I love the suggestions, Madam Attorney General, that you made in terms of what the NBA can do. Because one of the things that we're finding that we're doing more, even as relates to, if I use the example of the killing, the murder of George Floyd, and as you know, all of those big high-profile cases, if you will, that are gathering international attention are led by National Bar Association members, whether it's Ben Crump, whether it's Daryl Parks, whether it's Lee Merritt, whether it's Chris Stewart, whether it's Juanita Baker, and I can go on and on and on. And we're so proud of them because they're our leadership. But also recently, our leadership, I led the way on a meeting that we had with the governor of Minnesota, who reached out to the NBA and said, look, we've got a situation here. We are asking the National Bar Association to help us in our policing reform. We need help. So separate and apart from what's happening on a federal level, on a state level here, that's sort of an example. We just want to make it more global of where we have our governors reaching out to the National Bar, asking our lawyers and asking to bring us to the table because of, quite frankly, the work of many in the National Bar over the decades, and saying we would like your help in constructing an appropriate policing reforms. And our policing reform task force, led by Daryl Parks and Chief Clarence Williams, who is a former police chief and lawyer, retired lawyer, together they have put together a program that we are recommending for the state of Minnesota. And we would like to mimic that on a global basis, just based on what you were saying, tribunals, helping to establish tribunals with greater accessibility. We have, and when we talk about tribunals and accessibility, we have a phenomenal ADR section here at the NBA that Gloria Johnson helped to found. I think you probably know Gloria Johnson anyway. She helped to build and put that together. And so when we talk about international arbitrations at ICC and being accessible in courts, we are looking to see more diversity when it comes to that. That's one of the big thrusts of the NBA. And imparting that wisdom globally, I believe, Madam Attorney General, is an excellent way for the NBA to position itself to help. Justice systems and being able to also bring in accessible technology. So Julie, that's why I'm turning to you, because of the work that I know you've done globally on the continent and other places as it relates to technology and bridging the technological divide. So can you comment, Julie, on that aspect? Because at the end of the day, we want to have concrete solutions and projects that the National Bar Association can do, and leading the way and forging alliances globally to get things done. So Julie.
Thank you, Madam President. I love that you've brought that up, because it was at the National Bar Association, I think a couple of years ago, that when I was at Airbnb, we led a panel on the responsibility of the tech community to the Black community. When we think about algorithmic bias and software and technology that's building, and we think about the people building it and who's being part of that, who was part of that table in building that technology. And we know that, for example, and let me back up, that panel was also a panel with multiple types of people at the table. We had Benjamin Crump as a civil rights lawyer. We had Nicole Lee Turner, who's over at the Brookings Institute, who does this research around algorithmic bias. And then we had Donald over at Google, who was actually an engineer in the throes of things, right? Because you need those varied perspectives. And, let me just share a couple of examples. One, there's the technology, like, I don't know if you've ever been in the bathroom, you try to put your hand under the automatic soap dispenser, it's taken a long time, but then someone else comes in, maybe a white woman, a white male, and they're using it with ease, or the hand dryer is working with ease. Well, that's because the sensors haven't been built to recognize darker hued skins, right? But we got to think about who was the engineer that played a role in that, right? There was automated driving cars that were being tested out. They were running over darker hued test dummies as opposed to lighter hued test dummies. Again, because of the technology and the engineers, and not to any fault of their own, you were only limited to your experiences, and that is how you build and that's how you develop. So when I think about the intersection of tech and civil rights, that is the thing that I'm like worried about. You know, my former general counsel, one time he was doing like a, let me talk to everyone. And I had a question. I was like, hey, what keeps you up at night? And he was like, what keeps you up at night? I was like, hey man, you can't answer my question with a question, but that's fine. And he said, and I said, disparate impact keeps me up. I think about, I know that Ben, Lanita, Chris, Lee, I know they're on the front lines making sure Breonna gets justice, Sandra gets justice, Floyd gets justice. I see myself as being on the inside from a tech corporate product perspective, making sure that companies are building responsibly so that cars aren't running over people, or so that you can wash your hands in the bathroom. So that is the one big issue that I have sleepless nights about, thinking about the impact of technology to Black, Brown. I think about people who people who are building websites without thinking about screen readers, for people who have accessibility challenges. These are the things that I'm concerned about, all protected classes. And where I see the greatest disparities, not that there's any one more or less, but accessibility is starting to become an area that folks aren't really focused on and thinking about. And it is a place where it intersects into all of the races, right? So race, accessibility, color, obviously religion. We're seeing concentration camps across the world where people are trying to get people to become a different religion. There's a lot of things happening at the intersection of civil rights and tech. And my concern is disparate impact, and my responsibility is to make sure that companies are building with everyone in mind.
Absolutely.
Madam President?
Yes.
Can I also just add to that? I think that excellent exposition on algorithmic bias. But as we're talking about, my colleague there, Julie, is talking about a society like America, where you're talking about color, Black and white, people of color, Black and brown, but again, as America deals with these issues, and you're talking about George Floyd and police, let's talk about police profiling, not just in America, but also internationally. Remember that in countries in the Caribbean and on the African continent, there is still bias, also based on color or class. So the lessons that we learn through the NBA in America, again, can be transposed to other societies, and to help that mind shift, that people can understand why equality is important and why it is important to eliminate bias, and also why it is important to include people who are in the disability community. For example, when you're talking about digital translations, they are so often inaccurate. Closed captioning is inaccurate. What if we actually had people who are sound impaired, hearing impaired, actually helping with what the closed captioning could look like? That kind of thing. It's really important. And what you're doing here today is extremely important to bring about inclusiveness and diversity. And again, remember that it makes economic sense.
Yes, absolutely. And Latif, I want to bring you into this discussion. I see you were sitting back in your chair like you're getting comfortable, so I got to get you back in the front. So Latif, your experience, we talk about economic empowerment, collaboration and the diaspora. What is your perspective on what we can do as servant leaders, as lawyers in the diaspora, to bring about greater collaboration and to help each other? What is your perspective?
Wow. Yeah, that's a real challenge. I think we have a role to play in terms of what we do on a daily basis. But then we have this technology. that clearly, based on what Julie just laid out, that's going to keep me awake at night as well, because we do have this technology. And I think, for example, Facebook's largest investment in terms of infrastructures and power line that are under the sea and all of that has happened in Africa, where, as the Madam Attorney General pointed out, there's 1.4 billion people. It's a huge market for them, and they invest in, but we don't necessarily have a say in how that technology is used. So what each of us can do is to continue to highlight those inequities so that those of us who have a relative access can make it a point to make sure that, you know, African leaders, African market women, who, as far as I'm concerned, are the model of economic development in Africa, they have a say into how that technology is deployed so we can fully maximize the use. I think each of us in our respective capacity can keep doing that. We have a forum, we have a voice, and I think we ought to express that every time we can.
Absolutely. Can I just shift gears a bit to women, just to women? Because I have, you know, we had 2 men, but now we have 3 women on this panel.
The story of my life.
I would, and Latif, you have 3 daughters? I will. So I want to just shift really, because there's so much discussion that we hear globally, domestically, about the role of the woman, how that is shifting and changing. And so both, I pose this question to Madam Attorney General, first you, and to Julie. How do you perceive that role shifting? And how do you, and I'm going to raise this tough question, I think, Julie, we talked about last night. How do you perceive the impact, if any, on the family unit with these shifting roles of women in the diaspora?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think that empowering women actually strengthens the family. I want to say, I would like again to give a quote from the Secretary General. Everywhere, women are worse off than men simply because they're women. Inequality and discrimination are the norm. Globally, women are still excluded from senior positions in government and on corporate boards. Fewer than 1 in 10 world leaders is a woman. Gender equality harms everyone because it prevents us from benefiting from the intelligence and experience of all humanity. So, empowering women, bringing the experience of all humanity to the table, sets the role modeling for the next generation, bringing all talent to the table. So NBA, I'm hoping, will continue to agitate for women's presence on corporate boards, mentor political leaders, locally and statewide and nationally in the United States, but also in the diaspora, because we need that. Also, where we see obviously unjust laws, like laws that relate to child marriage, laws where women cannot pass their citizenship onto their children, laws where women can't inherit property, they too should be eliminated. And again, it just makes economic sense. The World Bank has pointed out that the output losses of gender discrimination is estimated at $12 trillion US, 12 trillion US dollars. And it is also estimated that if we were to actually close the gender gap, there would be in all countries an increase of 15% in national income. So what would happen if we actually brought women to the table in terms of the family? Socially and economically, I see strengthening of the family or the family situation.
Absolutely. And Julie, I mean, I'm, you know, of a certain stage. I've been a lawyer for 34 years. So whatever my age is, it is hypothetically, right?
37.
So, but you are of that millennial generation, and you've accomplished so much as a young lawyer. And again, like I said, we're so proud of you. What are your thoughts on that? Because your perspective is certainly going to be different. And I would share the perspective of Madam Attorney General for certain. But what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think I'd love to break this into two parts. I mean, one is the family unit, and then the second is work around girls' education. So with respect to the family unit, I think, I mean, well, we could spend a lot of time on this. I think that there has been so much um, destruction that has happened to the core of the Black family unit. I do believe that. Um, a lot of that I think is due to colonization. I think a lot of it is due to intentional destruction, which has become quite systemic in many parts of the world. Um, to Madam Attorney General's point, a lot of it is even so ingrained into some countries from a caste system or a class system on who belongs and who doesn't, and who is afforded opportunities and who isn't. And that is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. It's work that I've done as a law student at Texas Southern, when we were right across the street from the project housing community of CUNY Homes. But the rebuilding of the Black family unit, I think, is a multifaceted approach. I think government has a role to play. I think there's some responsibility there. I think industry has a role to play. I think the health systems have a role to play, because all of those components are important to the advancement of the Black family unit. And then tangentially to that, I would say, the Black family looks different. It's not always, man and wife, it's wife and wife, husband and husband. It's non-binary person and another non-binary person, a trans person. So I also try to think about that from an inclusivity lens as well, to make sure that all people are thought of it. Because once upon a time, a Black and a white person could not be together until the Loving decision. So family, obviously, the Black family is something that's very core and important to me. And is something that I think requires a multifaceted approach. With respect to girls' education, and really underscoring what Madam Attorney General has said here, this is, when I think of the generation coming behind me, and when I see some of the stuff that they're doing, I'm like, oh, we're gonna be okay, But I think where it really hit home for me is when I had the privilege of traveling to Liberia for Mrs. Obama for the CNN film We Will Rise. And I was responsible for the Liberian segment at the R.S. Caulfield School in a rural part of Monrovia. And President Ella Sirleaf, you have a woman president, you know what I'm saying? Like, let's just sit with that, right? So you have a woman president and the First Lady of the United States speaking with these amazing young women about their future and what they see for themselves, and reminding them that anything is possible. Anything is possible. It won't be without challenges or obstacles, but you must keep going. And we know that in many parts of the world and in many parts of Africa, the male is prioritized. So I think, being part of that. So if you ever see the footage and you see like chalk in the background that says "Let Girls Learn," I wrote that in different colored chalk. But that was probably one of my most memorable experiences, because for me, you're able to step out of your ivory tower or whatever in a White House or in your building or in the government, your brown building, whatever you want to call it, and see how community is actually being impacted on the ground and seeing what the needs are. So I'm encouraged by programs and projects such as what Mrs. Obama has launched in the White House and is still continuing to this day. The other thing people don't know, like everyone knows about President Obama's MBK Alliance, the Black Men Initiative, but no one knows that Mrs. Obama had a mentoring program of women. I participated in it for years, but she didn't. I don't think it was, and I'm not saying the president's was anything, but was because people knew about it more publicly. But for her, it was just like, this is important to me. I need to mentor young women. And my former boss in the White House, Jocelyn Fry, who was a classmate of Mrs. Obama's, created that program. Her and Mrs. Obama created it. And there were so many young women that I got to spend time with, especially the young women from the Southeast in Washington, D.C., at Anacostia High, at Ballou High, that I mentored, that changed my life in the process too. So anytime that I can be in a space to advance and support young women and men and non-binary people, I will do that. And I'm very hopeful, as Madam Attorney General has said as well, I'm very hopeful of what the future is if we continue to prioritize women.
Madam President, can I just throw in two things, please?
Absolutely.
Because I do believe that, and I'm talking to lawyers here, it's important that sometimes, as you know, that the law steps in. And I think it's important on this particular topic to talk about things like universal health coverage and universal basic income, some bottom line things that make life tenable.
Absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have to bring this program to a close. I'm going to give everyone just if you could do in 30 seconds. I know that's so little. Your closing thoughts, and I will start with you, Madam Attorney General, and then Latif, and then Julie, and then I'll get some closing thoughts.
My closing thought is to thank you, Madam President, for inviting me to be here today. I think that you symbolize, as head of the NBA, everything. NBA, not meaning basketball, National Bar Association, a woman at the head of it. All that we're talking about today, about changing the world, about fundamental mindset changes, about eliminating inequity and poverty, and real transformation that touches people's lives. So I want to thank you for your leadership in the National Bar Association, and I pray God's blessings on all of your endeavors. May they bloom more than you can ever imagine.
Amen.
And I am here in your corner supporting you 100%.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Latif, mon frère.
Well, thank you, Madam Attorney General, and Madam President, thank you. And thank you, my colleague, Julie. I'm going to use two brief stories, right? The first one is Madam Attorney General earlier listed a number of things that we could do that makes economic sense while we're empowering women. I think I look back, I grew up with a mother and a father, but my mother, who only had a primary school education, is single-handedly responsible for 6 of us graduating from college. That is a multiplication effect. So which means that we empower women, we get the benefits 6-fold. Another short anecdote is I was in Nigeria a couple of months ago, a couple of years ago before COVID, and I witnessed an interaction. My sister was trying to buy something at the market, right? So as a common sense person, I stepped back. I'm from America. I'm not gonna be part of this interaction. So then the buyer and the both pull out the phone. How much is it? They haggled and they agree on the price. I said, give me your credentials. I didn't realize what it was. It's an account information so she could pay for the transaction she had just done. They did that on the phone. We can't even do that yet in America. So technology can empower these women to heights that we cannot even begin to imagine. So I wanted to highlight those two issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Latif. And Julie?
Madam President, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this dialogue. It's been, I feel like I'm among giants. Latif, attorney, my Nigerian brother, amazing Attorney General. I mean, gosh, thank you for your leadership, your service, and for you to lead in that way. That's major. Twice too. You didn't just do it once, you did it twice. So I feel incredibly honored. And obviously, Madam President, thank you for your leadership. I think the one thing that I would leave folks with is let's continue to hold companies responsible for building for all, right? So as you're seeing things launch, asking, oh, who's at the table? The better question is who's not at the table and who needs to be here. So that is my plea, and I plan on continuing to do that. And I hope you'll join me in fighting that fight. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to leave you with a couple of vignettes. Julie, you mentioned colonization, and we didn't talk a lot about it. I would ask people to refresh your recollection and read this book that's a classic from France Fanon from Martinique. It's called Les Damnés de la Terre, The Wretched of the Earth. If you want to know about the diaspora and how we all got to where we are, what we think, colorism, all the issues, read The Wretched of the Earth in English, Les Damnés de la Terre in French. Excellent book. So I'm going to leave you with this vignette because as women, we're always juggling. The question is, who's not at the table, like Julie said? Who's not at the table? And a lot of times, we're not at the table. A lot of times, Black and brown people are not at the table. So I recall having the pleasure of practicing with who I believe is the greatest trial lawyer of all time. I really say that, and that's Willie Garrett. And the exposure and experience that I had in practicing with him was just incredible. And I remember when at a certain age that I'm not even admitting to being at this stage, I had my first child. And Sean Abney, who's the general counsel of the Gary firm, is also a great friend of Madam Attorney General and of mine. And I remember after I had my first baby, I had a mediation that was planned 2 weeks after I gave birth to my child. And I thought I would do like most women, you know, you take off a couple of months, whatever. I was still working at home, so I don't know about taking off real time, but I had this mediation plan, and our client was none other than the most brilliant person I've ever met, really, truly, Don King. Don King, if ever you all have had the exposure to him, when you sit and talk to him, is absolutely brilliant. So I wanted to attend this mediation, and you know, I just had a baby, and I was able to fit into a nice little outfit. I was just so excited. Now I may have fit into it some kind of look in some kind of way, but I was able to fit into it. And I went to the office. I was just going to make this exception, and I hadn't been separated from my baby, my oldest, Ozzy, who just graduated from high school. Imagine at this age having someone who graduated from high school, but just graduated from high school. And I was so excited I could fit it out. And I had on this beautiful, beautiful, you know, blue sort of St. John looking all together, had my stuff together. And I went to the office, and everybody, you know, I was just hugging. I was so excited. And I went into the mediation. And at a mediation, Gary firm style, you know, we're fighting. We're presenting our position. We're very aggressive. And I would just jump right in. I've been on this case from the beginning, and I just, you know, for 2 hours, I'm talking, Willie's talking, we're doing our thing. Our team is talking, we're excited. And I decided, let me go to the ladies' room. So I go to the ladies' room. And by the way, I hugged 20, 25 people, been in this mediation for a long time. I was excited to be at the table at this mediation. Went to the ladies' room, and I see something like that's white, you know, just so I look, and I turn around and look in the mirror and take off my jacket, and I have baby spit cascading down the back of my jacket. I mean, a nice little cascade, boom, all the way down my jacket. And because it was the first time I was separated from my son, I didn't realize it, you know, I just wanted to be at my mediation, and not a single soul told me that I had baby spit. And I thought I smelled, you know, milk in it, but you know, I in my imagination, first time I'm apart from my son. And when I tell you all, I was talking I was going to town at that mediation with baby spit cascading down my back. I got up, turned around, walked out, went to the ladies' room. I was so humiliated, but I promptly just wiped it off and everything and went right back in and continued on, because for me, I wanted to be at the table. So the bottom line for us is that we need to be at the table and keep fighting. And I'm going to end with that expression that our NBA family has heard me say so much. A luta continua, victoria es certa. The struggle continues, but the next part of it is victory is certain. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to the rest of the conference. Please tune in for our next seminar. It's called Force, Policing Reform, a Three-Legged Stool. And so, we have an extraordinary panel. I'm in my office here in Atlanta, Georgia, and Daryl Parks is downstairs on the first level at my office as well. And so this is an incredible panel, and all the things we've talked about today as it relates to police brutality will be addressed in this coming seminar. Thank you so much, Madam Attorney General. I salute you, and please send my regards to your family. You all don't know, I met her brother David when I was in high school in Toronto, Canada, many, many years ago. And I met your other brother maybe about 3 years ago, who's an incredible arbitrator, mediator internationally. Julie Wenah, we salute you, we support you, we elevate you. You are our future. Latif, my brother, thank you so much for what you do. He's, we call Latif a rocket scientist, because that's just how brilliant he is. Literally.
Don't go
a
there,
rocket
please,
scientist.
CK.
So I want to thank all of you, and to our Reverend Jackson, who had to run because he's fighting the fight here in Atlanta. He's going to be protesting. I say thank you to him, and we're so proud to be able to do an award this year in his name. So to everyone, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.